Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing great and following the 3H's of the channel. In this video, I have some absolutely terrifying stuff from the Green Mountain State, Vermont. So, as always, if that sounds like something you're interested in, pull up a stump with me and let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. I've lived in a pretty secluded area of Vermont all my life. There is a giant opening big enough for a field and 3 houses, each with a sizable yard front and back, but other than that, there's woodland all around. It may not count too much because there's a road that runs just quite close, but it's far enough away that you can't hear sirens when they go by. My house is in the middle of 2 hills, with an open field right next to it, and dense woods around both the field and the house. The field gets fairly long, however, sometimes to the point where it's above your head. Adjacent to this field, separated by a dense tree line and at the bottom of a hill, is another field, which rarely gets cut, and in which you can grow some pine trees. Around that field, however, is a large expanse of woods, approximately 30 miles and 230 degrees around. There is a creek running around it, and a path leading through it. My story is from a good few years ago, when I was around 8 years old. My father still lived with me and my mother, and I used to take walks with him whenever the weather permitted. We usually walked around the 2 fields. We created paths, cleared paths whenever we could. We also dug some trenches for water to travel through so that the paths did not flood too heavily. One day, me and my father were doing just that, clearing paths and clearing out a trench that we had created just 3 weeks prior of leaves and sticks that were clogging it. It was getting rather dark, but we both had lanterns with us, so we could still get some work done. Eventually, my father got tired and asked if I wanted to stop for the day. I, as a youngling back then, told him that I could keep going for a while more. He then told me that he was going to journey back and get some coffee and dinner, and he asked if I wanted to come. I rejected, as I could get more done if I stayed. This was not too uncommon for me, as I tended to wander off in my spare time. We had also taken our beagle with us, who tended to either wander around or stay near me, but who only barked if he saw something, which in a sense, I guess, comforted me, because she would have been able to alert me if something was near. Even so, it was dark, and there tend to be bears and coyotes prowling around, so I tried to work quickly so I could finish what I wanted to before I got too nervous. An hour or so passed, and I was just about done as my dog started barking. Turning toward her to see what she was barking at, I noticed that she was turned toward the creek. As I looked to where she was barking, I saw nothing. This was fairly abnormal, as every time she barked, it was at something in plain sight, at least enough that I would be able to see it, so I was a bit uneasy. When I finished what I was doing, I turned to walk home. Around this time, I heard a low snarl behind me, too low to be a coyote or my dog, and too dog-like to be a bear. I of course checked my dog first, and noticed her cowering away, but not making a noise. I was looking to see what she was cowering from. I noticed a black mass, akin to a giant dog, think a St. Bernard but much bigger, across the creek. I was noping out of there. I left my lantern and tools behind, and ran home as fast as I could, with my dog running beside me. As soon as I got home, I ran inside and attempted to find my parents. When I did, I launched myself near them and told them what happened. I don't think they believed me, as in the past I tended to make up stories about how I battled raccoons and wolves, but they comforted me anyways. While I was in bed, I heard a rustling in the tree line right outside the house. It may have been just the wind, though I think that something was moving around. The next day, My father asked if I wanted to finish clearing the paths, as there was a bit left to do that I couldn't have done myself. I was hesitant, but I agreed, thinking that I would be safe with him. I, however, did not want my dog to come with us. When he told me to get my tools, I told him that I had left them down where I was. He wasn't very happy about that. Walking down, I was extremely alert, looking around as much as I could. There was no evidence that anything large was anywhere near the path, and the path itself was only big enough for a single file line, but I was still skeptical. When we reached the location where my tools were, we noticed quite quickly that my lantern was completely destroyed, something which my father was furious about, as it had cost at least $100. My tools were fine though, so he wasn't as upset as he could have been. Working for the next few hours, we finished everything and more, leaving the next few months open to doing whatever, so long as there was no damage from heavy rainfall or snow. Before we headed back, nature called for my father, and he wandered out of sight. He must have gone a ways away, because it took him several minutes to go and come back, but when he did, he was running, urging me to grab my tools and run. He did the same. I was concerned as all hell. I asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer me, and instead looked around anxiously. I did the same. As soon as we were packed up, we ran. We were a good 5 miles away from home, so we were running for a long while. As we were running, I began to hear things break behind us. Not the occasional twig snap. I mean full-on, terrifying, lost shit. When I turned and looked to see what was doing it, I nearly froze in fear. What I saw was as large as the mass that I saw the night before, and it may well have been. However, because it was lighter out, I could discern its details. It was almost completely black, with dark red patches covering it randomly. Its face was akin to a dog's, and the rest of it was like a bear, the paws especially. When it picked them up, they looked like knives. Its ears were long and stood up, but I did not see its teeth. As we neared home, the sound of braking ceased, though we did not slow down by any means. When we got into the house, my father locked all the doors and collapsed onto the couch from exhaustion. I did the same, but I recovered more quickly because I was younger and a little more fit. As I looked out the window, I didn't see the creature, but I was still afraid of the woods, and was for the next few days. My father was too, eventually putting up a steel fence around the perimeter of the tree line, and a gate at the entrance to the path which he locked. My mother was not happy at all about this, but it gave me and my father some comfort, and so her opposition quickly went away. Over the next few weeks, my fear of the woods subsided. My father, however, was still afraid of whatever he saw, and over the next few months, I kept hearing him talking about not having enough money to keep paying for the house and wanting us to move. However, he had a really good job, and we were kind of wealthy, so we're pretty sure that it's just because he was still afraid. Eventually, he left, and he and my mother got a divorce. He occasionally returned to the house to check the fence and lock the gate, but my mother quickly got tired of him and got a restraining order against him. I haven't seen nor heard of the creature since the night that we ran away from it, but over the years, more so recently, I've begun to hear the fence creak a lot more at night, and that fear is coming back. When I was 16, my cousins decided to invite me up to a cabin they had in the Northeast Kingdom. They basically live on the Canadian border on my grandfather's family farm, and this is their hunting lodge. The Northeast Kingdom is pretty much wilderness, and is well known in my head for two things: entire towns of francophones who didn't get the English language memo and swallowing whole towns back into itself, its woods and hard living, and it's pretty close to a time capsule of Vermont culture. So one of the stories the locals tell is about an abandoned home on the hills above the village that I'm staying near. They say that it was originally home to a woman with powers, quotes. They never say it, but from the way they talk about her, I figure that she was a remnant of the Abenaki tribe, an offshoot of the Wabanaki that is prevalent up here. She supposedly lived and worked on the hill, and there are tales of her healing trappers and traders that made up the town before it became a logging area. She was said to have a tent at the top of the hill, and her only rule was that no one was to come unannounced into her home. She backed this up with presences, which are apparently different than the presence of the mountains, or knowing Vermonters, they're the same. They seem to be described as shadow people, and they would roam the hills at night to keep danger away from the woman. Now, medicine woman or not, she eventually passed away, and this was shortly after Vermont got hit with the sheep craze, and lots of out-of-staters decided to try their hand at raising sheep. With logging clearing the area quickly, it was only a matter of time before someone moved in on that little logging camp. Now the town itself is called Newport, not to be confused with Newport City, but the man was one Mr. Smith, according to local legend, and he was one of the first sheep farmers in the area. He made it big down in his home state of Massachusetts, doing some textile work, and decided that he would be trying his hand at a more rural pursuit. He bought up some land, part of which was where the old medicine woman lived. The locals had left it alone, figuring that whatever she did up there to bind the spirits wasn't something you messed with lightly, but Mr. Smith decided that her hilltop, with its views, would go perfect for his new home. He set about building a home at once on the property, despite his new neighbors warning him that the land had been home to someone who was liable to still want it. He would say, "She's dead. Her only care is how the worms eat her flesh." So, the Vermonters, being Vermonters, left well enough alone. The construction was plagued by bad luck from the very beginning. Tools were stolen or broken, workers crushed to death or maimed, the house's frame setting alight twice, and the talk of creatures moving around the home at night. Workers walked off, but still, Mr. Smith continued to build his home. He transformed the hilltop and the surrounding fields into orchards and pasture land. Finally, the house was finished, and Mr. Smith began to move in. The Vermonters approached him and complimented his house, but could not keep themselves from commenting on the strange events and how he must be worried. He insisted that he was not, and he even told them that he was planning a party once he had settled, on New Year's. The Vermonters nodded and complimented him again, and soon enough he was making plans for his family and furniture to make the trek up north. Over the coming weeks, he did comment that strange sounds were coming from the basement, like people laughing, but he could never find the source. He laughed it off, blaming drink and thin air, but he took to staying out and about from his home later and later. Soon, fall turned to winter, and he visited the village less frequently, but when he did, he spoke of things moving in his home and sounds of people on the stairs. One of his neighbors suggested that the natives were trying to come in from the cold, but he insisted that these were creatures. They were not human. As the days passed, he began to become increasingly jumpy, and men at the pub heard him speaking about them being outside his door. One night, the innkeeper claims that he came to his door in a panic, begging to stay the night. The only words that he could understand besides that were there were faces in my chambers, and they were touching me. The next morning, the man seemed fine though, and when asked about it, he seemed genuinely confused. He assumed that he had once again drank too much, apologized, and went home. Nothing more occurred, and shortly before Christmas, his things arrived. He had some men up to help him unpack, and they noted that he had barred all but one door with boards, including the cellar door. He insisted it helped keep the place warm. On the day before New Year's, his family arrived, and on New Year's Eve, he threw his party, as promised. It was lavish and festive, and when midnight approached, he stood on his chair and gave a speech. He spoke of conquering fear and taking back the wilderness from heathens. He spoke of faith in God and industry, and as he raised his glass to toast, the clock struck midnight. On the 12th tolling sound, it was like 1,000 feet were thundered up the stairs. The door, barred tight, burst open, and a wind as black as pitch blew through the home. Candles were knocked over, and when it passed, Mr. Smith lay dead. The Vermonters took him up, gathered his family, and left the house. And as they left, a great shriek erupted, and they turned to see the house engulfed in flames. It burned hot until the house was turned to ash, and only the basement and foundation remained. The Vermonters left the farm and the hilltop to nature, and the land was never resold. Now, my cousin's cabin is on this lake, not far from the supposed foundation of the home. Having been underage and a bit of a goody two-shoes at that point, I had not drunk myself into a stupor the night before in celebration of my arrival. Instead, I had gotten to bed early in hopes of getting some game to cook up the next morning. This meant that I was not hungover as hell the next day, and instead was heading up the hill toward a place that looked like a decent spot to camp. I had noticed it during the trek in, an overgrown orchard that was still producing fruit. It was a few hills over, so I had a hike to go, but nothing terribly draining. With luck, I would be in a position before dawn hit and the deer started foraging. I crossed one hill, then started up the other. This one had walls on it, brick and stone, which marked it as an old farm. I went around the hill, but when I spotted the foundation, I figured, oh hey, something to keep me out of the wind and to leave my gun on. I wonder if I can get a good shot down to the orchard. So I scramble up toward this foundation. Now at this point, it's basically a ring of stones, a few stubborn walls and a pit that would be the basement. The ground is covered in dead leaves, and the pit is halfway full with them. It's still a good 5-foot drop though, so it's not much use to me. After making sure that there wasn't a good spot, even if I could settle behind a wall, there wasn't a good shot there either. I decided to just go down and camp the edge and wait. Better aim, but more likelihood of being scented. So I skirt the edge of the pit, and as I do, I hear something rustling. It's coming from the pit. Being young and stupid, my first thought is not fear, but a sense of luck. I must have found one of the deer that got stuck in the hole. Easy shooting, and with some work, I could haul it up and out easily with one of my cousin's ATVs. There would be no sitting in the dark, freezing my tits off, hoping to get a deer stupid enough to not smell me. I could go home and get warm and eat with the others. If I skinned and gut the thing, I might even be able to take it home out of the ATV. It would be less back and forth running. As I'm planning this, I lean over to look into the pit. I expected a doe, maybe a young buck. I've been scared before in my life, and in my time looking for the paranormal, I have been in situations that haunt me still. But out of all of those times, 2 remain fixed in my mind. These are images that are fresh, haven't faded, and which convince me to keep looking for answers. One is my trip to Glastonbury. The other is this moment. I struggle even now to describe it. At first I thought it was a deer, or maybe a very large dog. It was tawny and had fur. It looked broken. It was twitching and writhing. If I could liken it to anything, it would be like maggots under the skin of a dead rabbit, but bigger and more of them. I remember feeling kind of disappointed because it clearly was starving, and I remember thinking that it must have been down there for a week, at least, because the stench that hit me was that of fresh pus and old blood. It was alive. I could see it breathing, but barely. I was looking at it from its rump, but I had a clear shot to its vital organs. I figured that if it was this bad off, the only thing to do was to let it die and move on to the fresh animals. I raised my gun, aimed, and shot. It moved. The thing moved, and I don't mean it rolled over or it flailed. It moved. It skittered out of the way on its broken, twisted limbs. As I watched, it stood, and I realized 3 things in the moment before terror broke through. It was not broken. It had been intentionally positioned that way. It had been lying with its spine contorted and legs and what I now spot to be its arms. It was bipedal and had a look of a twisted half-maw for a face. It had hands. Its legs were bent wrong. It was like a cross between a deer and a predator. I just woke it up by shooting at it, and somehow I knew that it knew that I had meant to kill it. I whipped the gun up, and as the thing moves toward what I now realize is going to be a chest-high wall for it, I raise my gun, and I shoot it in the thing's direction, and then do what any sensible survivalist does when faced with something of this magnitude: run like hell. I was gone in a shot, sliding down the hill, past the stone markers, not looking back. I could hear it thrashing and the branches snapping under its feet. I run and make the roughly 30-minute stroll in record time. I run even when the sound behind me stops and I get on the road leading to my cousin's cabin. I run until I burst through the door and into my room and lock the door. I hugged my gun for the rest of the day, and I only managed to come from my hidey hole for dinner. When I explained what happened, they laughed and teased me for jumping at shadows. The thing was, I felt watched for the whole rest of the trip, and things kept vanishing around the cabin: food, wood for the fire, small things like knives. After I got home, I came looking for something similar and never found it. Instead, I became interested in the paranormal, and after that began trying to document it so I could prove that I wasn't crazy. So those two were pretty wild, weren't they? If one of those encounters stood out to you, let me know which one it was. And if you have one of your own from Vermont or from anywhere else, I have an email in the description below that you can send it to if you'd like to. Also down there is a PayPal and a Patreon if you would like to support the channel that way. And I'm working on some kind of social media presence too, but we'll see how that goes. And with that, I think I will see you in the next one. I hope you enjoyed the videos this week, and I especially hope you enjoyed this one. And if you did, feel free to like and subscribe, and maybe check out another video. And with that, I'll see you next week. Thank you for pulling up a stump with me, and thank you for watching. Have a good one.